Santa Maria, Santa Teresa, Santa Anna, Santa Susanna, Santa Cecilia, Santa Capelia, Santa Domenica, Mary Angelica, Frater Ashet, Frater Pietro, Julianus, Petronella, Santa Santos, Miroslav, Vladimir, and all the rest.
Upon the steps and a baby cries. High above you can hear the church bells start to ring. And as the heaviness, oh the heaviness, the body settles in, somewhere you can hear a mother sing. Then it's one foot, then the other, as you step out on the road. Step out on the road. How much weight? How much? Then it's how long and how far and how many times. Oh, before it's too late. Call all angels, call all angels. Walk me through this one, don't leave me alone. Call all angels, call all angels. We're trying, we're hoping, but we're not sure how. Oh, and every day you gaze upon the sunset with such love and intensity. Why, it's almost as if you could only crack the code, then you'd finally understand what this all means. Ah, but if you could, do you think you would trade in all the pain and suffering? Ah, but then you'd miss the beauty of the light upon this earth, and then the sweetness of the leaving. Call all angels, call all angels. Walk me through this one, don't leave me alone. Call all angels, call all angels. We're trying, we're hoping, but we're not sure. Calling all angels, calling all angels, calling all angels, calling all angels. Walk me through this, walk one. Me through this one. Don't leave me alone. Calling all angels, calling all angels. We're trying, we're hoping, we're hurting, we're loving, we're crying, we're calling, 'cause we're not sure how.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm the one who always gets to introduce our speakers, and I read their bios first. And I get to meet some of them sometimes, and sometimes I don't. James Tyberonn has one of the most interesting bios that I have ever read. And I know that he'll be telling you some of these stories, but I have to tell you it was very hard to decide what to share with you. So I'm going to give you the basics and let him share some of the more interesting points. But if you've not heard anything about James Tyberonn, he originally worked as a professional engineer and geologist for 33 years. He's a native of Arkansas, but he worked abroad for 30 years. He circumnavigated the globe and traveled to over 85 countries in his geological work. He's always had a very deep love for the earth and a driven interest in spirituality and metaphysics all of his life. His spiritual awakening came in 1979 on the banks of the Amazon River, where a German man gave him the biography of Edgar Cayce. There is a river. How many of us have had really strange experiences how we come to the Edgar Cayce readings? He has since become such an enormous supporter of ARE, and he has been here before. The last time he was here, people said, you have to have him back, and please give him more time. So we did, and he has more time tonight as well. So Edgar Cayce has been an enormous influence on him. And if you go upstairs to the meditation room, you will see this gigantic piece of lapis lazuli that he has donated to ARE. We have two pieces that are en route that he has also donated. One is a 300-pound amethyst crystal called the Violet Dolphin, and an almost 300-pound clear quartz crystal, meditation crystal, which with the lapis lazuli, he is setting up in order to be a meditation amplifier. So thank you so much, James. Already the lapis lazuli has created this amazing energy added to the energy up in the meditation room, and we're really excited about receiving the other ones. You may have seen him. He's been a featured guest speaker at the United Nations. Anyone see him at the United Nations? He's been on the Travel Channel. He's been on National Geographic television, and he's authored over 6 books, of which I happen to have a couple here. I'm just going to hold up because he's going to be doing a book signing later, The Alchemy of Ascension, and The Earthkeeper Chronicles, Metatron Speaks. He's considered a leading authority on planetary grids, gems, and the nature of sacred sites, and he has hosted many Earthkeeper conferences and pilgrimages to sacred sites. We're so excited to have him back here, and he currently is residing in Texas, and he began channeling the Archangel Metatron in 2007, so you'll be hearing him referring to Metatron quite a bit. And he's featured each month in the Sedona Journal of Emergence magazine. He truly is a citizen of the world, and he dedicates his life to sharing the spiritual and sacred scientific information received from Archangel Metatron. And as a person, he is one of the most warm and genuinely kind people that I have ever met. So please give a nice, ARE, warm and enthusiastic welcome to James Tyberonn.
Thank you, Cheryl. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone adjusted in a good way? Yes? Yeah. Well, first, let me thank the ARE for this opportunity to be here. As Cheryl mentioned, I was a searcher all of my life, and in 1979, I was working in Brazil as a geologist on the banks of the Amazon River. I was the only North American there. Most people were Brazilian. And there was a German man that came along, and he was about to leave. Working on the Amazon was an extraordinary experience. At that part of the river, the width of the Amazon was about 13 kilometers. And there were actually dolphin in the Amazon at that area. And they're actually, because of the tannic acids that are in the Amazon, they're actually pink and purple in color. And so every sunset, these purple dolphin would come up. It was an extraordinary place, and so this German guy was leaving, and he said, I've got some books I'll leave with you, and he handed me a stack of books, and that was sort of the tradition in these work sites. I was working for Petrominas to determine the depth of a potassium chloride deposit. And so in this stack of books were 12 Louis L'Amour Westerns, which are really popular in those days. And there was one book called There Is a River, written by Thomas Suger. I picked it out first, and I read it cover to cover. And it absolutely changed my life. Arkansas, where I was born and where I grew up and graduated from university, it's Bible Belt, and my entire family were devout Baptist. My grandfather was a Baptist preacher. 2 of my uncles were Baptist preachers. And so the born-again aspect was really big with me, and I just couldn't put it all together. You know, I mean, so we're here, and if we just ask to be saved, then we go to heaven, and if we don't, we go to hell forever. And it just didn't totally resonate. So I went through that process 3 times. And you know, they believe once saved, always saved. And so I joined the church around the age of 7, baptized, and I'd hear these people talking about that experience they had, and I didn't have that. And so when I was about 12 years old, a friend of mine said that they realized they hadn't really been saved, that they had not had enough faith, and so they did it again. And I thought, well, that must be my problem, because I don't enjoy going to church. And so I did it again, and I did it again at 15, and after this, the preacher said, look, you're saved, don't worry about it. And so when I was sitting on the banks of the Amazon River and I read Casey cover to cover, I had that experience that so many people had described. I was walking on air for days, and I knew that here was an example of the nature, the true nature of our purpose on the planet. And it was a catalyst, because I was at that time living as an expatriate, living as a foreigner. And I did that for the next 20 years. And then I worked overseas my entire career as an engineer and geologist. And 20 of those were as an expatriate. So I had the ability to become a citizen of the world, to learn other cultures, to learn other languages, and a few other experiences that I'll show you in a minute. And so during that time, I was never particularly interested in local television, and I read every metaphysical book I could get my hands on. As of about 1990, when I was living in Africa, I think I had read every book that the ARE had in their store. And the reason was that I would come home once a year, and I'd buy 60 pounds worth of books, and I'd carry them back, and that's what I would read. And so it was a extraordinary opportunity and learning process that Edgar Casey made available to me. He showed me a truth that meant so much to me. And this organization here is a genuine light on the planet. I want to honor the people that are here. There is an extraordinary collection of people that work here, that dedicate themselves, and to you for taking that membership in the ARE and to coming and supporting them, because this is a wonderful organization. There are a lot of metaphysical groups, a lot of metaphysical branches. The ARE for me represents the Christos energy, and I've become involved in many aspects on the scientific, and Edgar Casey has a famous quotation, or at least important quotation for me, where he said, mankind will learn as much about the nature of God from science as from religion. And so what is our challenge now? What is my goal in the Earthkeeper organization is to recognize that our religion omit the scientific, and our scientific has omitted the sacred. And so at this time we need to bring them in full circle, and that's what I try to do. And the Edgar Casey material is a wealth of information that you can go into and find aspects of science that fit in, as well as the energy he carries, that great reverence. And so with that introduction, I just want to thank the ARE for this opportunity, and I'd like you all to give the ARE people a hand for what they've done in organizing this event. And so, as I told you, my uncle in Arkansas was a Baptist preacher, and he had a little funny story that he used to tell, and I like to start my presentations with a kind of a little joke, so I'll tell this one. That my uncle, who is, by the way, still preaching at 94 years of age in southern Arkansas, and he says that there was a church that was raising money to build a new property, and they were trying to bring the money in, and so the preacher came in and said, we really need $500 for our building fund. If there's anyone here that'll donate $500, you can choose the next 3 hymns. And so a widow lady in sort of mid-50s stood up and she said, well, I'll do that. And he goes, well, great. And so she donates the $500 and he says, well, what hymns do you want to pick? And so she stood up, looked over the audience and said, well, I'll take him, and him. And so, you know, it's no surprise to me that when you look at the audience of the people that attend metaphysical conferences, it's about 80% to 90% female. And that's an attribute that is an issue that should be noted, because it is the feminine energy that is the nurturing aspect of what needs to be brought into the planet. It is that aspect of nurturing that the planet needs. And so I want to honor all of the feminine that are in here. And I also want to acknowledge my partner of 34 years who I met in Brazil. And that's my wife, Ann. And Ann is from Scotland, and we met in Brazil, and October of last year, she was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. And so there has been a healing process in place. At the moment, she is cancer-free. She's still going through chemo, and I want to acknowledge her. Someone was talking to Ann a few days ago, and she has just had this great uplifting spirit, and they said, well, you know, chemo can affect your moods sometimes, and they said, Ann, do you wake up grumpy in the morning? And she said, no, I just let him sleep. So. Okay, so we'll get started here on the presentation. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Arkansas. And Arkansas is, a lot of you are probably not aware, Arkansas has the largest deposit of quartz crystals on the planet. There is a strata of quartz that begins right around Arkansas, right around Little Rock, and it goes for 174 miles, sort of in an inverse C shape, and just goes right to the border of Oklahoma. And it passes through another geological wonder where the largest deposit of magnetic lodestone on the planet exists in an area called Magnet Cove. And so you have this extraordinary combination of quartz crystal and magnets working together. And the Atlanteans knew about that, and I'll speak about that in my Atlantean talk tomorrow night. So in retrospect, it's no surprise to me that I was born in the largest quartz deposit on the planet, and then after I moved out of the States to Brazil, I lived in the second largest in Brazil for the next 7 years. And I would like to add the clarification that while Arkansas is the largest singular deposit of quartz, singular is the key piece. Brazil actually has a greater quantity of quartz, but they're located in several locations. The large location of quartz in the Brazil that's world famous is Minas Gerais. And that's an extraordinary place, and absolutely was an Atlantean colony, as was Arkansas. Why? Because of all the absolute crystals that were there. But so I spent my years growing up in Arkansas, and then I spent the next 7 in Brazil among crystals. And something happened while I was in Brazil that brought me into gemstones. I was not earning a huge salary at the time, and I was contracted to the Brazilian government to work with their Ministry of Minerals, and they changed the law where suddenly I got 25% of my salary in local currency. Well, the problem was I wasn't 25%. I was earning only about $900 a month then, so 25% of that was a fair chunk, and you couldn't put Brazilian money in the bank at that time. When I got to Brazil, 6 cruzeiros made $1. When I left 7 years later, 24,000 cruzeiros made $1. So if you put it in the bank and then went away and came back, it was worth half what it was. So the Brazilian people had a way of dealing with that. They either bought real estate, gold, or gemstones. And Brazil is a cornucopia of gemstones. And so my landlord just happened to be a gem dealer. And so I would get my 25% in cruzeiros. He would come to my house, and there's a photograph I want to find at some part and work into this presentation. I've got a photograph of me sitting with Jose, and there's a pile of emeralds, a pile of amethysts, a pile of opals, a pile of topaz, just everywhere. And so I would buy these gemstones. And after a while, I began to notice that there was an energy coming from these stones. And then the German fellow gives me a copy of There Is a River, and I read about Casey's remarkable teachings about gemstones. And so I ordered a copy of Casey's circulating file on gemstones from the ARE. It took me about a month to get it. But this was right about the time I'm getting all these stones. And so it had a remarkable effect on me. I became really aware of the energy of these stones. And because of the unique integrity of Edgar Casey, reading what he said about gemstones was absolutely credible to me. And if it had come from just another source, you know, I might have questioned it, but after reading the remarkable story of his life, of his incredible integrity, of his incredible humility, this was an honest man. And his readings were extraordinary. I mean, really extraordinary information. The information that he provided on diet, on the medical readings, is to this date unmatched. And it shows a credibility. And for him to come out and speak about gemstones in the way that he did is the final piece. It's where the buck stops. It's real. And so I had that experience of being in a country where I not only had access to these stones that he talked about, I had a need to get them because that was the only way that I could save my money. And so this quotation comes from his reading 2285. We find that the crystal in the gemstone has a helpful influence if carried or worn about the body, not just as an omen, not merely as a good luck piece or good luck charm, but rather the source of those vibrations that are needed as helpful influences for the entity and are well to be kept about the body. Well, I've got quite a few references to his readings in this presentation, and I'll bring them in, but why are gemstones, and this was the base question that I've come to, what is it the gemstones do and how do they do it? And so this is what I'm going to base the first half of this presentation on, and that is the integrity of the human aura. So we all have an electromagnetic field about our body. And it is the etheric part of ourselves. Our etheric body is the genuine source of who we are. And just as the Earth has a magnetosphere around it, each of you, each human body has an auric body and a light body. And so gemstones affect the etheric body as well as the physical body. And the importance of each of you understanding how to regulate the human aura is extremely important. There are a lot of shifts taking place on the planet right now. And the need to understand how important your etheric field is enormous. And gemstones and minerals and crystals absolutely fortify the etheric body, absolutely allow you to have an encased, intact auric field, and that is huge. How many of you have actually seen auras or can see auras? Quite a few of you. How many of you are convinced that the human etheric field exists? Almost everyone, I hope. It needs to be regulated. It needs to be understood. And so I've spent a lot of my time reading, particularly when I was overseas in places like Russia, India, and Africa, where we lived for 7 years. I read the information Casey provided about auras, but also there is another brilliant source of information from a man by the name of Charles Leadbeater. How many of you have heard of him? He is not that well known, and if you have an opportunity, the ARE bookstore may even carry his books. He died in the early 1900s. He was part of the Theosophical Society with Helen Blavatsky in the UK at the turn of the century, and he has written some brilliant books about the etheric body. And what I am going to attempt to do today is to, for the first half of the presentation, is talk a little bit about what affects the human aura and how important maintaining the human aura is. It is not auto-regulated, and there are a lot of issues that cause us to have leaks in this field. The planet Earth has an aura, and it's called the magnetosphere. You have an aura. It has 12 layers, and it is a ovoid shape. It has a shell around it, and it has a circuitry that flows. And it is essential that you maintain this auric field flowing perfectly. And there are a lot of things that affect it, and that's what we're going to talk about. If you get a leak in your auric field, and we all do, you're going to lose energy. And so it's important to understand auric mechanics, auric maintenance, and then how gemstones are energy and light generators that can not only allow you to keep your aura flowing optimally, it can increase the field of your aura. It can give you a bigger aura. And beings of light, people that are light workers, that are working in spirituality and metaphysics, are going to carry greater light within your auric field. But that comes with a responsibility. And the reason is light attracts bugs, right? On a magnetic field, the closer you get to the positive, the greater will be your pull to the negative. And these things exist in the University of Duality. We live on a planet of duality, and I'll talk about that tomorrow night. But we live where there are opposites. There's light, there's dark, there's positive, there's negative. And anyone that knows the science of magnetics on that spectrum, the greater you get to one end is the greater the attraction from the other. So you need to learn how. I mean, all of you are spiritual people, but how often do you suddenly get this wave of something's not right, something's attached, you get a negative feeling, you bump into negative people? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and I'm going to talk about how you manage that. I give a complete talk on auric maintenance in the Metatronic Shield application, the Metatronic keys. I'm just going to touch on it here today because I'm going to save the last half to talk specific about gems. The point that I want to make now is that your auric field, now more than ever, needs to be understood and needs to be managed, because the energy is increasing and we are going into higher dimensions on the planet Earth. So auric integrity is absolutely essential. And this is what I believe that the light body looks like. There is a circuitry attached to it when it is perfectly in shape. This is what I refer to as the Merkaba, and it is a 12-pointed stellar star. That's a separate presentation. It has a certain type of rotation, and gemstones can be used to maintain that. I think that in 2012, the Earth expanded. How many of you think that humanity has ascended, that humanity ascended in 2012? A few people? I suggest to you that humanity has not yet ascended. Look around the Earth and we see wars and greed and corporate issues taking place. I suggest to you that what has happened in 2012 was the planet ascended. And what do I mean by ascension? The planet expanded into 12 layers of dimensional fields instead of just 3. And I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow night. The reason I believe this occurred is coronal mass ejection, solar storms. This was first spoken about, not with my interpretation, but first spoken about by Greg Braden, Susan Joy Renison, and other people. But there have been more X-class coronal mass ejections, solar winds, since 1990 up until now than ever before combined on the planet. All of the X-class solar flares that took place previous to 1990, say from 1989 to 1900 when they began exploring them, during the last 20 or so years, you've had more than all those others combined. And that brings in billions and billions and billions of tons of nitrogen ions, of anionic ions. There are jet streams circulating the planet now that have never been there before of anionic plasma. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that affects the human aura. But it is an expansive effect. A study at the University of Southern California showed that when ion generators were used and given and put around people in a closed room scenario, that they began to hallucinate. And so they concluded that the out-of-body experiences that humans had were simply induced by the brain when the ionic ratio changed. I, on the other hand, look at that study and say, this is what opens the pineal. Because Native Americans have been going to certain places on the earth for decades. And this is referenced by Dr. Bernice Barlow, who wrote a book called Sacred Sites of the West, where she showed that certain of the sacred vision quest sites, holy grounds of Native Americans, had a different anion to cation, negative to positive ratio in the background. And there is a ionic ratio everywhere. It's part of science. Normally it's about 5 to 3. When it is shift 6 to 1, people begin to have visionary experiences. And with billions and billions of tons of bombardment of anions through solar storms, which is a fact, what's going to happen? We're going to start having an opening of our pineal gland. And through the pineal, we go into these greater dimensions. And each dimension has a different law of physics to a certain degree. And we have a different layer of our auric field. And we have to learn how to operate within those. I suggest to you that we have more chakras available to us now than we did 15 years ago. And I talk about that in the Metatronic Keys. But the point is, auric maintenance is huge. We have this other body we have to learn how to manage. And gemstones can be a part of that. So the aura is encased in a protective ovid sheath, somewhat like the planet's magnetosphere, and it must be kept intact to be in optimal flow. And there are certain factors that can short circuit the aura and create fissure cracks. So the aura requires certain maintenance. I refer to it as 13-20-33. That's something that I got from the Metatronic readings. But it is an issue that we have to face. All right, the causes of auric maintenance, the causes of auric fissuring. Stress, makes sense, yeah? Conflicts, negative thought forms. Casey said that thoughts were things, right? Well, I, a few years ago, received this interesting calling. I was actually living in Africa, and I went to London for the weekend. And every weekend in London, or almost every weekend, there was a psychic fair that took place at the Hampton Hotel. And so if I had the weekend there, I would go, and it was just amazing because they would have all of these readers from India, from the area of Calcutta, or what was at that time Bombay. And so they were talented, and they were palmists, they were astrologists, and so I had a couple of readings there that were good, and if I had the day there, I'd have 2 or 3. You know, they weren't too expensive at the time. And so one of them said to me, "There's a Native American standing behind you, and he wants you to do a vision quest." I thought, well, okay, let it go. And then 6 months later, I'm back in London. I get a different reading from a different person that tells me the same thing. A few months after that, I'm in Calgary, Alberta at a psychic fair, and I get the same thing. So I started looking on the internet, and I decided, well, I'm going to do a vision quest. What's a vision quest? And I was interested in fasting, and all the ancients, you know, fasted. And so I finally found a facilitator, a Lakota, and for sort of organic tea made out of a root. It sort of tasted like boiled mud, and but I did it for 5 days. And I did the first one in the around Sedona. I did the second one in Tecate, Mexico, on the reservation of a Yaqui Indian. And then the third one I did in Mangus Mountain in Red Rock National Forest. And I finally had an out-of-body experience. But it was an extraordinary experience for me. And I realized through my series of vision questing that thoughts had an incredible vibration. You could actually, because of my size, I didn't even really feel hungry for the first 3 days of my fast. And I didn't really get the effects. And that's why my guidance had been to fast for 5 days. And I really did 6 because you have to make these prayer ties, and 440 of those, and that took me a full day. And so the effects would start coming in on the 4th and 5th day. And occasionally these elders would come visit me. And in that 4th day of fasting, I could see not only their auric fields, but when they spoke, you could see a color come out. You could feel their thoughts. Well, Edgar Casey said that thoughts are things. Thoughts are living vibrations. And so what happens, to bring this to point, what happens when you get in a conflict with somebody? When you get really, really angry, you create a thought form. The Native Americans have been referring to this for years. When I quested in Tecate, Mexico on the Yaqui vibration, how many of you are familiar with the works of Carlos Castaneda, the author? Well, there is a shaman mentioned in his book called Don Girano, and I met him. And he came at the end of my vision quest I was with Adam Yellowbird, and I met Don Girano afterward, and he was in his mid-80s. Looked like he was 50 years old. And he had an incredible presence about him, and he had toured with Yellowbird into Australia, sponsored by a group that was bringing indigenous together. And the first thing that he did when he saw me was throw these negative thoughts at me, and it hit me in the stomach like a punch. I wasn't expecting them. And it was a lesson to me that I'll speak about a little bit further. But basically, what these shamans of the Yaqui and a lot of these indigenous groups do is practice a shamanism that does not have spirituality in it. But they play with energy fields. That energy exists. And I got hit in the stomach with it, and I felt sick for the next 3 days. And I told Adam I didn't want to go back to Tecate, Mexico. But the point is, whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, your thoughts have a vibration. The yogi books say that if you're angry and you hold an apple, don't eat it. Don't give it away, because that anger will put poison in it. So when you get into a conflict with someone and you have energy going back and forth, a ping pong game of negative thought forms goes back and forth. So you have to realize that when you get angry in the first place, your aura fissures, your aura opens. And then at that point, you're open to negative attachments. If you're in an anger conflict with someone and you're getting angry, you're going to have an opening right here. And the Castaneda books always talk about the third chakra being the target. And that's certainly where Don Giorano hit me. And we later had experiences earlier in Africa and in Brazil and the Amazon dealing with that sort of thing. So you have to understand that you have to control your emotions. And if you are in a conflict, you have to deal with that conflict to a certain degree from a state of dispassion. If you let the emotions open the field, then you're going to lose energy, and you're going to have these things attach, and they do take. They do take energy. Does this make sense? Are you hearing? And so there are certain ways you can protect against that. Fear, what Casey called the great destroyer. Fear shatters your auric protection more than anything else. And if you think about it, everything else comes down to fear. In a sense, angers are based in our own fears. In fear, and you very often go to emotional lows and in depression. A vicious cycle takes place. Once you start thinking negative, then the law of attraction is such that the next thought you pull in will also be negative. And then the next one will also be negative. And the thing about spiritual people is that there are so many people that I have met in metaphysics that are able to give but not to receive. Spent so many times, so many lifetimes in the cloth as nuns, as priests, in monasteries, where we lay down prostrate and prayed for forgiveness from original sin. We were taught to be unworthy. And we don't have that sense of self-love. And so one of the biggest things that we have to do is to learn how to love ourselves. And there is an imbalance. You know, we have, you've all heard of Don Miguel Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements. The fifth agreement is to have an intact aura. And to keep it intact, you really need to have love of self. And Casey talks about that as well. But when you get into when your auric field is open and you get depressed, pretty soon you start thinking about something terrible that you did and you wish you hadn't have done, or somewhere where you didn't achieve something that you might have wanted to achieve. And one thought of failure brings in another, and it can become a chain reaction. The same thing with depression. You can start feeling sad about something, and then it pulls in another sad thought, and then you're spiraling, and what's happening is your auric field is depleting. It's just like a tire with a hole in it, and you have to snap out of it. We are at a time now where you have to become more responsible for your thoughts. You can't fall into depression. Depression, according to Casey, puts out an enzyme in the bloodstream that affects the organs, affects the health. So does anger. The worst of all is shattering fear. So we have to learn to control our emotions to keep our emotional field intact. And there are gemstones that I'll talk about in the second half of this presentation that are literal light generators that add force to your field. But the key to all of this is you have to understand the mechanics. Gemstones are lights on the path, but they're not the answer. They're the flashlights, but your feet still have to get you across. And Casey speaks about that as well. These are patterns, these are allies, these are assistants. But you, mentally, have to do the work. And you have to understand, and not that many people really understand arc maintenance. I promise you, we knew it in Atlantis. We knew how it worked then. But in this age, year 2 of the new Earth, there are new dimensional accesses. And we have, because of that anionic surge, the ability to more easily go into the pineal. Remember I talked about the 6-1 ratio? That's real. And so we are here on the earth as co-creators. And what you think becomes real. What did Casey say? Mind is the builder. Mind is the builder. The purpose of life, from a Metatronic perspective, is to learn how to be responsible creators. And there is a professor that teaches that called Dr. Cause and Effect. And he makes house calls. And so we learn one way or another. And so when we make mistakes, we learn from that aspect. But you are now in an area of enhanced creativity in year 2 of the new earth, where what you dwell on, you create. And if you let your auric field become open, you're going to lose energy. You're going to have people attached to you. Law of attraction applies to thoughts. If you think a negative thought, it's going to pull in another one and another one. And unconscious thought drift can have the same effect. There are other non-emotional causes to auric disruption. And these include going to certain sacred sites that are very, very powerful. I'll talk about that briefly. Ascension symptoms of the increasing Schumann resonance. The vibration of the earth is picking up. And I have a slide where I deal with all these in just a second, and I'll explain it. Air travel breaks open your auric field. On the surface of the earth, there is, and this is science, there is an anionic charge that is emitted that goes all the way up to the stratosphere at 30,000 feet. And there the cationic or positive charge exists. And so what is between the surface of the earth and the surface of the stratosphere is a capacitor. And that's why lightning occurs. And interestingly, the charge within that capacitor field is 7.83 hertz, which happens to be the same frequency as a theta brainwave. And so that energy field is within there. And all of our organs are tied to 7.83 hertz. And NASA discovered that when they started sending astronauts up into space, they started having irregularities with the kidneys and the other organs. And so what did they do? How did they resolve it? They put in an ionic generator that put out a Hertzian field of 7.83, and it regulated everything, including brain waves, or it made them more, it made for a more compatible environment. Now, when you get on an airplane, and you fly above the level of the stratosphere at 38,000 feet, you're no longer in that Hertzian field. And that metallic fuselage of the airplane further deflects any other vibrations to that. So what I suggest to you is that when you are on an airplane, that you are outside of the Schumann resonance. And when you land on the other end, your R is not quite working right. You have auric bleeding. We call it jet lag. And it's not as bad for a 2 to 4 hour flight, but when you fly from point A in the United States to point B in Europe, and you've been out of sync for 8 to 12 hours, there is certain disruption of the arc field. There is a fatigue. And there are, and so this is an example of how a non-emotional issue can open your arc field. It's a fairly easy fix, but it's important to understand it. You know, mineral baths, hot baths, right diet, right mental attitude, but the time frequency shift is happening. But the point is, when the arc sheath has leaks, it has effects on you. And you have to understand when these occur. And so these are all disruptors of the arc field. Computer use, you know, that low frequency electrical energy that comes from computers. And we've known this for a long time. Airfare, as I mentioned, if you go into, I've got a separate slide for that, so I'll save that one. So again, these are the points of arc fissuring: air travel, emotional lows, controls, depression, stress, conflicts, negative emotions, fear and anger, energy differentials, microwaves and cell phones, computer use. A lot of the times I teach webinar, and just before we do a group meditation, I ask people to step away from the computer and put water on their face and come back. There are things you can use to neutralize this a little bit, and I'll talk about those in the second half. Negative thought forms. Untoward astrological patterns can also affect you. So now I'm going to deal with these one at a time. Don't let bad feelings or negative emotions control you. You have to consciously decide to be positive no matter if your mood is low. There are certain astrological patterns when it's easy to feel kind of grumpy, when it's easy to have that Mars influence and you've just had enough. How many of you are keenly aware of moon cycles? When, you know, that day or two before the new moon, boy, that's a day when everyone's testy. You know, that's, I used to, you know, watch out for the red flags when I'd go to the office the last 3 days before the new moon. That's when people were really testy. I never have an Earthkeeper event on a waning moon, if I can, unless there's an eclipse. Yeah. But for the most part, when we have events, I do it on a rising moon. And so there are cycles, there are astrological waves and patterns, and that's what astrology is gravity patterns that can affect your mood state. But you have the ability, mind is the builder, says Edgar Cayce, to choose the attitude that you want, to choose to be positive, and to control that. Cayce says that mind is more important, is stronger, will is stronger than any astrological pattern. But you have to engage the will. You can't just flow with your feelings, or you're going to be floating on the tide of astrological waves. You have to choose. You have to create. And what are we here to do? Learn how to be responsible creators. So you realize that thoughts attract other negative thoughts, and you filter out the negativity. Gemstones absolutely can help. I'll show you a list of these. You know, the Vedics have always understood this, and they would have you choose a collection of stones, and when Mars was in a certain red energy phase, they would have you wear a blue stone to turn it into purple. And that is a science. And so there are gems that are uplifting for a variety of reasons. I don't look at gemstones on colors and colors alone. Colors are important, but there are other aspects of gemstones that have not really been brought forward as of yet that I'm bringing forward, and that's their molecular structure, their geometry, their density, their ability to refract light in one of two ways, and I'll talk about that in the second half. But fear is the great destroyer. According to Cayce, fear is the spiritual opposite of faith and can be the cause of illness or dis-ease. It can actually put enzymes in your system that cause your organs and glands that control your chakras to shut down. And again, think of the auric field as this ovid, And when you have these problems that come in, it's like the tire that's leaking air, except you're bleeding energy. And when you're bleeding energy, your circuitry goes out of whack. And that's what we want to talk about, being aware of the aura, understanding the mechanics of what puts holes in it. So fear is the root vibration of doubt, depression, guilt, self-denial, lack of self-love, anger, jealousy, and hatred. And I know about fear, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. But auric bleeding and the fear associated with negative emotions absolutely depletes the auric field. Fear is tangible. How many of you have been to India and seen these people that are able to charm snakes with the vibrations of certain flutes and hand movements? The key, I spent 6 months living in India, and they would tell you, you could go out and talk to these guys. They were in front of every hotel in Bombay, which is now Mumbai, and they would tell you that the one thing the snake will attack is fear. They will attack fear. So I don't know if you can recognize the people in that. That is Ann and I, taken many years ago, and we were in a war zone in Africa where a political coup took place, and we had 3 days of absolute terror and fear. Terrorists took over, and they started burning the town. They started taking hostages and putting motorcycle inner tubes around people, filling the tires with gasoline-soaked rags, and then setting it on fire. And the people would have a horrible death. And we had that around us for 3 days. And the French Foreign Legion parachuted in, and they rescued Ann and Bobby and took them out, and they took the men by airplane, and they took the men to a safe place. But it was a very powerful, as you can imagine, experience. And those of you that get emails from our son Bobby, that's Bobby taken about 26 years ago. And it was an interesting phenomenon because there was absolute terror, as you can imagine. And there was no protection. And we were in a very isolated place, and we literally had to hide for our lives for 3 days. And there were a few other expatriates that we were able to stay in contact with. Houses got broken into and burnt down. Ours got broken into after we were already rescued. But there was a tangible field of fear that took over that entire town. And fear is contagious. And the fear turned to violence. And it was a tangible energy. Any of you that have been there would sense it. And if you gave in to that fear, it absolutely shattered your auric field. And you were immobile. You know, they talk about the Stockholm syndrome, where hostages suddenly become in alliance with their captors. There was a sort of a sense of that where people just gave up. The people that became totally full of fear became paralyzed. Other people that were able to handle a little bit more were the activators, and the ones that gathered the other people around and said, look, you know, let go of it, snap out of this, you're going to be okay, we're going to get out of this. But we didn't know. And for 3 days, we were hiding, and we were at the mercy of whoever, whatever groups, because it became, and I saw this later in Venezuela. Ann and I were in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez attempted his coup d'etat that failed. But that energy that is often politically motivated, when it becomes fear-based, it turns to violence. And that violence turns to hatred. And it's no longer political, it's evil. And you can feel it. And it is debilitating. And at some point, if you don't push it out, it's going to destroy you. Ann and I experienced that. She and Bobby were flown to another town by the French Foreign Legion. The men were protected. But it was an interesting study because some of the other people that were there working that didn't really handle it right had to be transferred out. They had mental issues, because when you experience a fear that is deep, that is so deep, it absolutely pollutes the body. And there were men and women that needed months to get over that. But in retrospect, it was a very powerful learning experience for Ann and I. And it was interesting in retrospect to look at how powerful that fear vibration was. And so in retrospect, although it was tremendously traumatic, after I got out of the energy of it, I could look back and see how poison fear was. And you know, we were living in Brazil and in Africa in areas where people studied, had voodoo, and they would project thoughts at you, and it was an on-the-job training that I experienced in ARC maintenance, learning how these things work and how to deal with them. And they always attach at the solar plexus. And if you are able to deflect that, you can overcome it. And I was telling John earlier today that, you know, we dealt with the psychic attack, for lack of a better word, those that project thought projections in an untoward way in South America and in Brazil. And I said, but I met the real masters of psychic attack when I got into corporate management. Point being that whether someone is deliberately sending negative energy at you or just wanting you to crawl down because they are your boss, there are energies taking place. And you have to learn how to manage them. I'm going to tell you an interesting story. Several years ago, the company, the engineering firm that I worked for, got bought out by a different company. And I was sort of toward the end of my career, but there were two young guys that were pretty sharp. And the new guy comes in, and immediately he, you know, puts his thumbprint on their forehead and intimidates them. And he says, you know, we're looking at you two guys, and we can only keep one of you. So I'm going to be watching you for the next 90 days, and we're going to let one of you go, and we'll keep one of you. So I just wanted to be up front with you. Well, okay, so what does he do? He launches a fear attack. So one of the young guys says, oh, well, look, you know, I'm here, you know, I'm married to the company, and whatever you need, you let me know, and if I'm not measuring up, you let me know. And he starts coming in an hour earlier and staying an hour late. The other guy, and I knew them both, they were both good people. The other guy says, well, he says, you know, I've been pretty consistent with the company. I know my job, and so if you have any issues with me, just let me know. He said, and you know, he came in at the regular time and left at the regular time. He didn't get bowled over on fear. 3 months later, which one do you think they kept? The one that did not react in fear. When you react in fear to someone, they take your energy, and on a different level, they have less respect for you. When you keep your energy field intact, and you don't let them penetrate and don't let them draw energy from you in a certain way, they respect you more for that. And that was an interesting observation for me, because the other guy was trying, really trying, but his fear made him appear weak, even though he was trying harder. Now, there are certain situations in life when it's appropriate to give control to someone. If you're a parent, you've got a certain responsibility to train your kids in the right way. If you're in a job, you've got a supervisor that you have to please. But you don't sell your soul. The minute you suck up to people, in a way, you're losing energy to them. I used to tell people that I worked in a French company for 33 years, and I said that we didn't have management. We had kings and their kingdoms. And to a certain degree, it was their loyalty. They looked at your loyalty more than they looked at your productivity. And so there are all sorts of aspects tied with this. But in general, and I was always in a situation where my nationality wasn't particularly popular overseas. And I had the experience of living in a country where I was a minority for 7 years in Africa. And And I was always in a situation where I was an American in an arena where Americans were not very well liked. And so it was a teaching experience. But overall, I learned through on-the-job training about auric maintenance, from the fear factor, from the control factor, and from the guys in Africa that would put crossed feathers on your desk with a circle of powder on it, where they had put voodoo spells on you. And then from the corporate guy that tells you he's got his eye on you and your job's at risk. It's all fear. And the people that keep their auric integrity intact were the ones that were best able to handle it. So fear is a major issue. And there are certain mechanics of how you handle conflicts. So the full intact aura is not leaking right here. And this is always where the first leak takes place. And this is always where you get attacked. When I was vision questing on the Yaqui reservation, that Don Gerano sent about 3 bullets right into my solar plexus that made me sick for 3 days. I wasn't expecting them. And when someone scares you at the office, or when you get hugely angry, that's where you first leak energy. And so you have to understand the mechanics of controlling your emotions and the responsibility of keeping that circuitry intact, because your auric field has a circuitry. And when your circuitry is working, then you can put your thought into reality faster. And very often in conflicts, he who is strongest is going to win. He who keeps that aura intact, doesn't let the emotions take over, deals with it from a sort of detached position in a sort of Mahatma Gandhi way, non-aggressive resistance type of situation. What happens is that energy that's trying to attack gets ping-ponged back, and then they have to deal with it. If someone is constantly trying to intimidate you, and you don't get angry back, because that's when you lose, but you keep that auric field intact, that energy is going to go back to them enough to where eventually they're going to deal with it, and they're going to feel the return of what they sent out. And that's the way that the mind controls. When you keep this auric field intact, then you're able to create your reality. Your will wins over, in a manner of speaking. So look at this. You got 2 people involved in a conflict situation, and I'm going to give you an example of how this works. Say you've got a football team in California and a football team in Virginia, college teams. They're both undefeated. They're playing for the national championship in the Fiesta Bowl, and the fans are all behind it. The stadium fills up. There's 50,000 people for the East Coast in the stadium and 50,000 for the West Coast. And they're laying their hearts out. They're putting all this passion out. That stadium gets covered in their emotional energy, represented here. One team wins, the other team loses. All of those 50,000 people on the team that won leave that stadium vibrant, invigorated. And the team that lost, that put that emotion out there, leave bummed out and depressed. And they stay irritable for 3 days. The other team's on cloud 9 for 3 days. What happened? They passionately became involved, and they put that emotion out right here. And when you put a lot of emotional passion out there, and then you lose the conflict, the other person takes your energy, and you lose. And you're depleted for a few days. The same thing happens in conflicts. You have to learn how to deal with conflicts without it splitting your aura open through dispassion. I'm not going to talk anymore about that in terms of techniques. I just want to point out that's the mechanics of how it happens. And the key to auric maintenance is understanding the mechanics. In the second half of this hour, I'm going to talk about gemstones and how you can use these generators to fortify your aura. But they are lights on the path. You still have to make the right decision. But they are absolutely energy generators. And I'm going to talk about how they work and the different attributes of how they work. Just a couple more slides to go through. Conflicts can and do turn into a ping pong game of negative energy, and so you have to be aware of that. Light attracts bugs. There are people, and this is a thing that light workers never really recognize. There are people that are conscious energy takers, like the voodoo practitioners that I knew in Africa or experienced, and then the ones that are attacking without meaning to. Sometimes bosses, although they're meaning to, they just don't understand how the mechanics work. But there are other people that have leaky auras that will attach to you and take your energy. And so these may not be of malicious intent. Some are aware of it and most are not. But the end effect is the same. And so let's talk about a few of those. Energy takers can be people who are depressed, needy, attention seekers, people with a mentality of lack and a woe of me mentality. When you have these states of mind, you're in a depression condition and you're leaking energy. And so how many of you know people that are constantly sad and you get around them and then you come back and you're tired? You know, they took your energy. And so there has to be a way, particularly you that are healers, of learning that you have to operate your auric field in a certain way or you're going to take on the attributes of the person you're trying to heal. These people are not malicious. They're unconscious energy takers. And you're an unconscious receiver of their energy unless you learn how those mechanics work. Does that make sense? Can you relate to that? And so you have to keep that auric field sealed. And you have to bring in energy that when you're a healer, you bring in a certain way that is not a two-way street. When you give energy, it's energy that you're channeling in. If you're giving energy from your set stock, then you're going to make yourself sick. So when you're a healer, you're bringing in an energy and you're becoming an energy channel. If you're just dipping energy out of your field until an equilibrium is reached, then you're going to both be, one person's going to come up and you're going to come down. You want to be able to give from here and stay here if you choose to be a healer. If you are not channeling it and sending it out through a conduit, you're giving them your life force until they come up. And you're going to go out of there tired, they're going to come out of there built up. So you have to be aware that people that are depressed and needy, people that are attention seekers or have that mentality of lack are depleted. They're bleeding energy and they're attracted to people. Some of you, particularly those of you that have been nuns and light bearers in past lives, you just have this desire to give, to nurture other people, but you have to keep that field intact. And people that are needy are attracted to the bright lights, to take that energy, to get that energy fixed. Another form of energy takers is over-opinionated people that are forceful, controlling, bossing, used car salesmen. You know, literally, I've walked into, places where a forceful salesman, and right away I can feel it like a punch in the stomach. And so they're just doing their job. They're not malicious, but they're trying to attach right here. Because when you control somebody, whether you recognize it or not, you're sending an energy appendage from you're here to they're here. And that's how people that are controllers control you. And I won't go into the experiences that Ann and I have had of that type, but we lived in a lot of variety of communities, and we used to know an Irish fella in Brazil that he would attach and you could feel it, and if you weren't careful, you'd walk out of there exhausted. But he was just opinionated. He just wanted you to believe how smart he was, how much he knew, but he was taking energy. And he consciously did it. And there are people out there that if you're walking around open, will attach and take your energy. So it happens in the same way with salespeople. You just have to keep your auric field stable. Don't walk around with chakras wide open. Keep that field. Does that make sense? Yeah? Another field of energy takers, zealots, gurus who need followers, religious fanatics, people with messiah complexes. And we meet this in the new field. I've got this new message and I've got to teach it. When people get into zealotry, they lose balance. You know, the higher you get in metaphysical leadership, the easier it is to get an inflated ego. And when you get an inflated ego, your circuitry is not right. That's not the spiritual pattern. Humility is a key. And that's why the Casey material is so important. You've got grounded people. You've got people that are not telling you that it's my way or no way, or it's the only path. Edgar Casey had an occasional beer. Edgar Casey had an occasional glass of wine. He occasionally ate bacon. He occasionally smoked a cigarette. And it's that middle path. So many people in metaphysics are just, I have to do this, and I'm not saying that being a vegan or these other things are not good. But the idea that you take on the middle thing, that you have to be this way, can create an imbalance. You get people in metaphysics that loft so high up that their feet are no longer on the ground, and they become airy-fairy. People can no longer relate to them. And let me tell you this, that your challenge now, and I'm going to close the first half, you need to be able to work up here, but you have to keep your feet on the ground, because the only way you're going to influence other people is by relating with the masses that don't necessarily believe what you believe, and you change them through example. Your goal is not to change them. Your goal is to be the best you can be, and if that changes them, great. And so this idea of the Messiah complex is one of the traps that we hit in metaphysics. This idea that when you become a leader in metaphysics, your ego gets really big, and you have to be careful that you're not feeding on the adulation of people, that you don't need it, that you don't have to have a follower. You've got this message you got to share. And that creates a circuitry imbalance, and you bleed energy. So that middle path is huge. But be aware that light attracts bugs. And when you get that bright field, you're going to have something that blindsides you occasionally. It's part of the turf. And you have to understand all of these different nuances. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this because I've got other topics to cover, but is this making sense? Is this, yes? Okay, so just one other slide and we'll take our break. The last thing I want to mention on this before the break, certain sacred sites that you go to, and that's very clear, so I'm sure everyone understands it. Certain sacred sites that you go to, let's say we go to Sedona. Or Mount Shasta, better yet. And let's say your auric field is intact and it has a Hertzian frequency of 20, and that's just arbitrary. And you're going to this area that's a sacred site that's really, really powerful. And it's a magical portal. And it has a Hertzian energy of 150. Well, if this is a magnetic sheath, and then this is 150 or 100, and this is 20, you're going to have a mechanical differentiation occur, an equalization. You're going to implode. Your R is going to equalize, and you're going to bleed energy. I used to go to places like Glastonbury, England, when I lived in Africa, and after 3 days I had to get out of there. Suddenly I was feeling bummed out, and that is how I learned about that. But that is a fact, and it occurs. And so there are certain things you can do to stabilize your aura, but sometimes when you go to mega sacred sites, that is what happens. So we're going to take a 15-minute break now. Is that right, Cheryl? Yes, right. So 15 minutes, and I'll be on the stage if anyone has any questions for me, and I'm going to start on the second half of this, and I hope you've enjoyed this.
Thank you, James Tyberonn.
its own face, prone to fly. Sky grown, wind blown wings flown, over air blown, back tonight. Flashing, freely clashing, love of chaos, love of one. Bright storms, rising free falls, wild swans up against the sun. Spirit, none go near it. All men fear it more than night. Some say love goes one